pleasure to be here in this wonderful city of Istanbul with people that are committed to the future of construction, of cities, and, of course, of Turkey. I come at a time of sadness as we remember the earthquake, and I want to express my condolences to all those that have had losses in the earthquake, who've suffered from family members killed, and the terrible destruction of earlier this year. I also want to express my condolences to all that are suffering in the region from the conflicts. And of course, to also look forward to Friday and the celebration of the 100th anniversary of this wonderful republic. A time for rejoicing, a time for renewal, a time for thinking about the future and how the next 100 years will evolve in Turkey and the world. I am here thanks to the invitation of GYODER and its chairman, Mehmet, and I want to express my thanks as well to them and to the organization for inviting me back. I've been to Turkey many times. It's always a pleasure, it's always changing, and it's embracing the future. It's a place where East meets West, and we sit here in Istanbul at the crossroads, not only the crossroads of cultures and time, but of course of history. This great city was the biggest city in the world for many, many hundreds of years. It was the city which was referred to as the city of reference. It was the city, in a sense, where cities were invented. And so coming back to Istanbul to think about the future of cities is totally appropriate. And not only, of course, of the future of Istanbul, but the future of cities throughout Turkey, including those that have suffered so terribly in the earthquake, through cities in the region and cities in the world that can learn and need to learn. Because the future of cities will be very different to those of the past. Turkey is also unusual in not only being the birthplace of the greatest city in history, but also, of course, because such a high share of its population is urbanized. 77%, I think, of Turks now live in cities, which is higher than other countries with equivalent levels of income. Most of the world's population is living in cities, and within the next 30 years, well over 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities. They are our future. All the great problems of the world will be defined by how we manage our cities. Whether we are able to create jobs, whether we're able to overcome the inequalities, whether we're able to overcome the great challenges of climate change, whether we're able to stop pandemics, whether we're able to create livable, clean, sustainable cities, is going to determine the future of humanity. And so for all of us that are concerned about urbanization, for all of us that are concerned about cities, this isn't simply an academic or a local interest. This is about the future of the world. It's about whether we are able to grapple with the scale of the challenges that humanity faces. It is no exaggeration to say that our future will be won or lost in cities. This isn't new. Cities have always been, since they developed rapidly in the 17th century, at the scale they are now, the place where this happened. And even before this, as you know from the history of this great city, cities shaped the world. Cities were the sources of invention. They were the kitchens in which history was being cooked. They are the places where things come together, the different ingredients of cooking, the ideas, the people, the products, the different specializations to create. And it's that unique attribute of cities, the ability to cooperate, the ability to specialize, and the invention that comes from that, which makes cities different. Cities are the reason why humanity has advanced so rapidly. Cities are the source of invention. Cities are double to triple times the level of productivity of rural areas. And it's that because when people come together, diverse people with different specialities, when people are able to explore areas that they are particularly good at exploring, working with others, and when they have access, as you do in a great city, to others and to the needs you need, to the finance you need, to the legal advice you need, to the architectural advice you need, to the specialists that can only congregate in places of scale, that you are able to do things very differently. And that's why cities will continue to define the growth of the world. Something like 80% of world economic growth now driven out of cities. But if cities are so great, and if this is happening, why do we need to worry? We need to worry because cities are under threat. Cities are under threat from a number of different factors. Istanbul less so, but many cities, particularly in Europe and the US, have seen COVID-19 and the pandemic as an existential threat. Many wealthy people left the cities. Remote work meant that people were no longer going into offices. And so what we've seen is the decline of central business districts around the US, Canada, and Europe particularly. And of course, what happens is that as offices lose their demand, as people no longer go in, the ecosystem around the offices, the barbers, the baristas, the dry cleaners, the restaurants, and everyone else loses their jobs. Small businesses that depend on offices are collapsing. And we see in San Francisco today this very dangerous potential death spiral of a city. It can happen. That cities, particularly those cities that depend on central business districts which are isolated from homes, from residential and from entertainment, collapsing. And of course, as the revenue generated by these offices goes down, so too does the income of the cities, and therefore their ability to provide services. Services of security, services of public transport, community services. And that's indeed the threat that San Francisco, a great city, is facing. So remote work poses a real threat, particularly to offices and central business districts which are isolated. And that's a very bad design feature. They also pose a threat, I believe. Remote work poses a threat to young people. All jobs are apprenticeships. We learn by being with other people. We do not learn on Zoom, we do not learn on Teams, and we do not learn through remote isolation in our own homes. We learn by being with other people, formally and informally. And organizations learn by challenge that young people bring into them. They become more dynamic. Many people like working at home, but it's extremely negative for productivity, for creativity, for culture of corporations and businesses, and of course, it's a threat, not only to the young people, but to the ecosystem and to the offices. So that's one big challenge that cities are facing, particularly in the advanced economies of Europe and North America. A second big threat is, of course, climate change. Cities are heat sinks. Cities bring together people. They're more effective, and the carbon footprint, the greenhouse gas emissions of people in cities is lower than in the countryside because you don't travel as far and because you have more efficient residential and entertainment structures. But they're hotter. And as cities become heat sinks, the livability of cities is a big question. If you're rich enough, this is not a big problem. You know, amongst the most rapidly growing cities in the US are Las Vegas and Phoenix, which are in the desert. 50 degrees is not a problem in Las Vegas because it's an air-conditioned cocoon. But it's for most places, and certainly for Istanbul, it is a problem. And then, of course, there are other impacts of climate change. Water, fresh water supply, and ocean rise. Tidal surges, storms, hurricanes. My group in Oxford is predicting 1 to 2 meter ocean rise this century. So cities that are on the coast, as much as Istanbul is, as cities like Izmir and many others in Turkey are, cities around the world like Mumbai and Dhaka and Jakarta and Miami, New Orleans, Los Angeles, London, and many others have a real existential threat. And how one builds resilience and how one copes with this is a big, big issue for cities around the world. The third great threat that cities face is politics. What we've seen with rising inequality is an anti-big city populism. Big cities are not popular with politicians. Whether it's New York and San Francisco in the US, whether it's London in the UK, or Paris in France, Berlin in Germany, or elsewhere, populist politicians are saying, let's level up. Let's reduce the inequalities between our cities. And I support that. Of course, we should have lower inequality. But there's a real danger in that, which is by trying to reduce inequality, we slow growth, we slow dynamism, and we pull back the source of our growth, which is our dynamic cities. Our big cities are the geese that lay the golden eggs of our economies. And if you try and strangle the geese, the whole economy will collapse. This is a very dangerous political tendency. We need to support our dynamic cities. And the only way to create more wealth around our countries is to make our big cities even more successful. There was a great paradox, and this is the fourth great challenge, that technological change and globalization would lead to a more distributed world economy. Some of you might recall the book by Tom Friedman, The World is Flat, symbolizing the idea that technological change and globalization would lead to the spreading of opportunity. Another book of that time with a similar idea around technology was The Death of Distance. The idea that you could do things anywhere and that place would become less important in a globalized world of the internet and rapid technological change. But what we're finding, by contrast, the evidence shows us that place is becoming more important, not less important. Where you are born, where you work, where you live matters more than ever. The world is not flat, the world is spiky. The world is mountainous. And the high mountains where the economic concentration is are growing higher, and they are the dynamic cities. So being in dynamic city is the best way to transform your life. It's the best way to improve your life expectancy, and it's the best way to escape poverty. And that's what we're seeing around the world, and we're certainly seeing it in Turkey too. But the question is, of course, why do people stay in left-behind places? And here, particularly in the US, but also in Britain, in France, and around the world, we see when we ask people, why don't you go to the dynamic places where there are jobs, people saying we cannot afford to live there. And that's what the evidence shows us, that dynamic cities are becoming less and less affordable. The shortage of housing, the congestion on public transport, the shortage of school places and other supportive infrastructure, the difficulties of moving to cities is a major impediment. And so if we want to create more equal societies and more opportunity, we should focus on issues like affordable housing, public transport, education systems, health systems, and others that are able to absorb many more people. And that focus on how you create more equitable, sustainable cities needs to be at the center of our agendas. How you build resilient cities. Because one thing we know is that the world is not going to get easier as we go forward. It's going to become more and more complex and more dynamic. We're in a period of history which I've characterized as the butterfly defect of globalization. Complex, dynamic systems, hyper-integration of connectivity around the world. This means that the instability in the system, the upside and the downside, is more amplified. Many upside potentials coming from new technologies and from hyperconnectivity. New jobs, new investment opportunities, new health, the new vaccine that we saw developed in 9 months following the outbreak of COVID-19. New types of cheaper energy. These are all incredible upsides of this hyperconnectivity and creativity around the world. But there are downsides too. The downsides we see in climate change, we see them in fake news, we see them in the manifestation of new types of pandemics, and of course in rising tensions and conflicts. This will not go away. The system has evolved at revolutionary speed. The institutional structures, particularly the institutional structures at the global level of the United Nations, like the Security Council, are evolutionary. And so this tension between very rapid change over the system and very slow change of governance means that there's less and less governance at the global level. In that world, we should expect risk to rise. More climate shocks, more pandemic shocks, rising political tensions, and of course, the need to make sure our cities are the shock absorbers for this. Our cities are able to absorb these shocks, house our populations, create communities that are resilient with sustainable jobs. Augmented artificial intelligence is going to create many new breakthroughs in health and in other areas, but it's also going to take away a lot of jobs. Anything that's repetitive, that's rules-based, that doesn't require dexterity or empathy can be done by robotics and machines. And so the question for countries like Turkey, which have lots of people that still have to climb through the rungs of the development ladder, doing semi-skilled jobs, is what are the jobs of the future? And where will these jobs be? What places? What we're likely to see is that augmented artificial intelligence will increase the returns to people with high skill. And that means further increases in inequality, unless, of course, we do something about it. What this means also is that many jobs of the present, like call centers, like manufacturing repetitive jobs, are likely not to be there in 10 or 20 years' time. And so thinking about how our cities create jobs, and as our societies age, how we can ensure that everyone in our societies, the young people and the older people, are able to find sustainable homes. So rethinking our cities in the light of these changes of the 21st century becomes more and more important. The terrible disasters that we see in earthquakes and other destruction, as we've seen in Ukraine as well, of cities, creates, through this horrible experience that people are going through, an opportunity to rethink about how do we construct cities of the future. What is it that's different? While drawing on all the richness of the past, and of course, where the earthquake struck was at the heart of ancient civilizations. How one marries the past with the present and future is the great challenge in a city like Istanbul and in many other places. But one thing we've learned through all of this is the importance of community, the importance of cities in not being simply a collection of individuals, but people that care about each other, people that have a sense of purpose, people that believe that by being in a city, they are bigger than themselves. As you might remember, Margaret Thatcher is attributed to have said, "There's no such thing as society, there's only individuals." I believe on this, she was quite wrong. We are what we are because of the society in which we live. We are and define ourselves through the communities we live in. What we saw in COVID-19 was this remarkable outpouring of solidarity of individuals for others. Many people made sacrifices. Many lost their lives on behalf of others. Not only the doctors and nurses, but also people doing regular jobs, looking after other people. And we checked on our neighbors and we checked on our friends, and we recognized that this is what being together is about. And as people have moved into cities, they have often felt as independent and individual, leaving behind the old family structures that they might have come from. But what we recognize now is the need to recreate and have cities where we are as a community, that there's a bigger purpose than simply going to a city to make money or to get an education. And the purpose is understanding this common humanity, the sense of solidarity, the sense of compassion, the sense of doing things on behalf of others and making the cities bigger than the sum of their parts. The great city of Istanbul, over 15 million people, but much bigger than the 15 million people that are in it, because it's rising above to say something else about how when people come together and work together, they pollinate. Like bees in a hive pollinating, creating something much, much bigger. And this coming together is what's always been the reason why cities have been so successful. So when we think about the past and celebrate the fact that there's an incredible legacy, and that Istanbul has come through, as all great cities have come through, very big challenges of the past. One walks around this city and feels the weight of history, the sense of what's happened here before in extraordinary ways. It's visible everywhere. But as we think about that in the past, over 2,000 years, and we think about the next, I think we need to recognize that although every generation says this time is different, it really is now quite different. It's different because of this constellation of factors that are coming together. It's different because the way the world's changing is accelerating. As you spend your time this evening and tomorrow at this conference, enjoy yourselves, relax, because this is the slowest 24 hours you'll know for the rest of your lives. The speed of change is accelerating because of this complex, dynamic movement in the world. And that means we need to not believe that the past will be the guide to the future. We need to draw on the past. We need to be ethically rooted in what's important to us. We need to have an honesty and compassion which guides us. That does not change and should not change over time. But while drawing on that strength of who we are and what we are, we need to recognize that we need to do things differently in the future. We need to be able to take from this treasure chest of experiences of the past, of other places, of each other. We need to be able to take from this treasure chest everything that we can do to construct a future which will allow us to say that we've left Istanbul, we've left the cities of Turkey in a much better way than before we engaged. And so I want to congratulate GYODER, and I want to congratulate all of you for embracing the challenge of the reconstruction of the earthquake-shattered cities, for embracing the challenge of thinking in fresh ways about how to make livable, sustainable cities. There are wonderful models around the world. Others are engaged in this journey as well. You are not alone. But at the same time, you are in a unique position because you're at this extraordinary time in an extraordinary country and an extraordinary city where you really can make a difference. Thank you very much.
Ian, thank you very much for the inspiring speech. Please stay with me a little bit longer on the stage because I'll be inviting Mr. Mehmet Kalyoncu, the president of GYODER, here to exchange some gratitude. So. Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much.
Thank you.